Hello, beautiful souls. Welcome to the journey of discovery of self, of other, in realms beyond space and time. My name is Adrian, and I will be your guide. Okay, so as you can see by the title of this video, I'm going to be talking about the connection between autism and gender identity. So, I've known about this connection for a while now, but I came across one YouTube video discussing the findings of a particular meta-analysis, and it was great information, but I started to feel a lot of resistance to the way this person was making sense of the data. And I'll be honest, I was getting increasingly frustrated as I was discovering more and more people that shared the same interpretation. It's like, yes, some things I agree with, but I'm getting the sense of some misalignments between the neurotypical perspective and the neurodivergent perspective. I will say though, I'm very glad that I continue to watch videos on this topic, because eventually I found a whole presentation that very much aligned with my own thoughts about it. And at the end of the presentation, we heard from Dr. Diane Ehrensaft, a developmental and clinical psychologist, and I was just amazed at how beautifully she explained what is happening with this connection and her own experiences with people who are both on the autism spectrum and gender expansive. Quickly back to the way that I was seeing a lot of other people talk about it, I think my main issue was that it was leaning too much in the direction of this is a deficit. Like, it's a fundamental flaw, even though they weren't outright saying that. But the way they discussed it was like, well, autistic people don't understand their own internal states or that of other people, so of course they are also confused about their gender. I just don't think that's an accurate conclusion to make. Like, yes, I understand that sometimes we have trouble naming what we're feeling, and yes, sometimes people would describe themselves as being confused about their gender. And also, I'll say that when I first heard about this connection a couple of years ago, I was immediately worried about that information getting out to people, because I just knew some people would see trans people are mentally ill, they're just autistic and they don't know what they're talking about, because that's literally how bad people treat autistic people, and have all sorts of negative assumptions about what it means to be autistic. And it's like, just because there is this connection doesn't mean every single trans person is autistic, or vice versa, for one thing. But think about it this way: are autistic people actually flawed in their understanding of social situations, or is it just a different perspective than that of neurotypical people? Because I'll be honest, from my perspective, I think autistic people and other neurodivergent people, but autistic people specifically, are just perceiving more in any given scenario. So are we really confused just because we don't understand people, or is it because we're really confused? Like, that what we're really confused about is the way all the energy and emotions we're picking up on don't always match up with the actual words that are coming out of someone's mouth. Because that's confusing. It's confusing to be feeling what other people feel, and I know people love to say that autistic people aren't empathetic, but it's definitely part of the spectrum, either hypersensitive or hyposensitive to certain stimuli. So I guess maybe I'll clarify that maybe I'm speaking specifically about autistic individuals who have heightened empathy. But back to the point, it's confusing to feel other people's emotions, but then notice that their words aren't lining up. You get a situation where you feel like you should respond in one way, but then things people are saying and the way they're acting are giving the impression that a different response is wanted. So that feels confusing. And then on the trans perspective, is it that we're confused about our gender, or does confusion just come into play in the recognition that the way we feel and want to express ourselves isn't lining up with societal expectations. I think a lot of the time trans people know exactly how they want to show up in the world, but sometimes societal expectation and the need for labels and putting language to it all gets in the way. Like, in a way, I agree that social difficulties in the autistic experience might very well translate into gender difficulties, but the interpretation that makes more sense to me is that if you're someone who perceives much more of the world than the average person, it does make sense that you would also perceive outside of the society's understanding of gender, and vice versa. If you can perceive that your gender is not defined by the sex at birth, you might also have a lot of autistic traits, or have an autism diagnosis. This is exactly what the research shows, that autistic people have a greater likelihood of being gender diverse, and that trans people have a greater likelihood of having an autism diagnosis or testing higher for autistic traits as compared to the general population. There's variance in the different studies depending on exactly what they're looking at, if it's people with gender dysphoria or people who identify as trans or non-binary or gender diverse, and if they're looking at people who have an autism diagnosis already, or if they're testing for autistic traits. But across all those studies, the thing that remains clear is that autistic people are more likely to be trans than neurotypical people, and trans people are more likely to be autistic than cis people. That connection is undeniable. So yeah, it has a lot to do with the fact that the way that certain people have explained this connection just gives me the ick. Like, yes, even my very diagnoses give me the ick. Like, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, gender identity disorder, autism spectrum disorder. I mean, it certainly feels like a disorder, but that's only because neurotypical people make it wrong that the way I interact socially is different, and that my gender identity is different. It feels like a deficit when I have to be hyper aware of what is expected of me just so I can feel safe from judgment of other people. It feels that way interacting in spaces that are very much made for neurotypical people and not neurodivergent people. But you get yourself into a space with other people like you that also share some of your interests, and you no longer feel that way. Or if you just find someone who is open and accepting of you, it stops feeling like a disorder, because it's not. It's just a different variation of the human experience. And I want to bring up a very interesting point Dr. Aronsaft mentioned in that video that I was watching. She said, if you ask a neurodivergent youth during a gender evaluation, so how do you imagine you're going to present yourself differently after you transition from one gender to another? The example being, after someone has said, I'm a transgender guy, not the girl everyone thinks I am. So she'll ask, well, what is that going to look like? What are you going to do? And she said, they'll look at you blankly and go, well, nothing. I'm just going to be the same. And that really stuck with me, because for me personally, I have physically transitioned. My outer appearance is different from what it was before, but I'm not any different. I don't see myself as any different from who I always was. And there's such a disconnect between me and my family when discussing my transition. I always say I'm the same person, and I always was, because I'm not my body. I'm my soul, you know? And they just don't see it that way. My grandmother literally said to me, I don't understand why you would change your whole being. But it just shows me how no one actually sees me for who I am. in any aspect, really. Like, not just gender, but like, in everything about me. And I'll probably lose a lot of people with this understanding, but I truly believe that in a lot of cases, neurodivergent people and autistic people specifically have heightened spiritual perception. I mean, explain it away as just a greater capacity for pattern recognition all you want. Like, that's true, but it's often more than just that. Our awareness is more expanded, at least when we're allowing it, because when you don't know how to navigate it, it's definitely overstimulating all the time. And it's a struggle to be hypersensitive to things that are common in our experience. So it's like, depending on what things you're sensitive to, it can be quite difficult to navigate this human experience. But a lot of people are able to handle life much better when they become aware of what accommodations are beneficial to them. It can take off so much stress. It's literally life-changing when you go from not understanding why you're so distressed all the time to having the understanding that you just need to shift some things in your environment so you can be more comfortable. Because there's nothing wrong with us. We just haven't yet found all the tools necessary for us to thrive. And I also want to take the time to express my sadness for those of us who are high masking and closeted for the majority of our lives. I'm sorry that in order to cope with this world, we developed high levels of anxiety and depression in order to socially camouflage ourselves. I'm sorry to those of us that took extreme measures to appear normal, to hide our social differences, and to bury our authentic gender presentation until reaching our breaking point, until being so burnt out that we just can't continue operating in the same manner 1 minute longer, until suppressing ourselves so much that the pain of hiding actually became more painful than the fear of being judged for our differences. So, I mean, that's really my whole 2 cents on the issue. I think autistic people are more likely to also be trans or non-binary or just gender non-conforming because we're perceiving outside the boxes society has created as a whole. Without being influenced by societal pressures, our natural state is really to just be free-flowing in all areas of life. We have trouble with rules because rules are made up. And we can't just make ourselves believe that rules have to dictate our lives because it just goes against our nature entirely. And honestly, I feel like I could go on about this forever. There's just so many things to get into that I didn't even talk about, and of course a lot of nuance that I didn't want to get into because I was focusing more on just like one aspect of the way that people were interpreting this connection. I could also get way more esoteric about it all and say there's something actually deeper underlying the autism and the gender diversity, because really it's all just terms that we put certain symptoms to trying to understand something. But what if there's just this huge fundamental misunderstanding or lack of knowledge or lack of language to describe what is truly going on? It's just seeming clear that there's not too much coincidence going on here, you know, because categories and labels are extremely useful and can literally make your experience more manageable or even enjoyable, but they're also very limited. So, I mean, feel free to tell me what you think. Just be nice and respectful. Okay, bye.